I'm not the first one to tell you that the Legend of Zelda series is one of the greatest video game franchises of all time. For running on 35 years, these games have provided uncountable hours of adventure to young and old. From the bright and sunny overworlds filled to the brim with secrets and a feeling of freedom, to the dark and claustrophobic dungeons which test both your wits and ability, playing Zelda encompasses a wide range of experiences and emotions. Game to game, you never know exactly what to expect either. The art style has changed dramatically, and the series has experimented with different perspectives from top-down to fully three-dimensional to even side-scrolling, although people tend not to talk about that last one. The end result of this variety is that no two playthroughs of a Zelda game are identical. Every time, you're bound to discover new secrets and strategies, even if you've beaten the game several times prior. This leads players, or at least those with a certain mentality, to ask, what else can be done? Can I beat the game without collecting any heart containers? Can I slay Ganon without using any of the upgrades at all? And how fast can I do this? That last question, it turns out, is a dangerous one because it can't be fully answered. There is no limit to how fast you can finish any game, or if there is, humans will never reach it. So Zelda meets the wild world of speedrunning. Now, as anyone knows, different people have different styles for playing video games, including and especially Zelda ones. In Breath of the Wild, some people made sure to finish every single shrine, some were content with defeating all 4 divine beasts, and a bold few paraglided directly to the castle. The playstyle I'm talking about today I like to refer to as the Go Fast principle, GFP for short. It is the simple stipulation to do everything as quickly as you possibly can. Adding the GFP onto any game produces a wealth of new ways to experience the game world, new tricks and techniques to master, and a higher skill ceiling than ever before. It transforms the game. And when it comes to Zelda, it's not just a handful of people applying the GFP to it, but rather thousands and thousands. What is it about this series that makes speedrunning it so popular and appealing? Of course, they are some of the most beloved games ever made, but probably a similar number of people have fond childhood memories of Halo or Call of Duty, and those series have only a tiny fraction of the relevance within the speedrunning community that Zelda has. So what is it then? What's the key? Today we're taking a look at the speedruns of every mainline Zelda game to try and figure it out. So to investigate why Zelda speedruns are such a big deal, and why they're so cool, in my opinion, we're doing a good old-fashioned ranked list. This won't be based on how good or bad the speedrun is, as I think it's pretty strange to make a value judgment about this kind of thing, nor from longest to shortest or anything like that. Instead, we're going to study the games in chronological order and create a shocking speedrun coefficient, or SSC, for each of them. Now, if you've already watched my video on ranking Mario speedruns, stick with me here because I'm altering the SSC formula a bit. The first 2 metrics, as before, are glitch and sequence break. A glitch score of 1 means they are hardly used at all, while a 5 means the run revolves exclusively around them. A sequence break of 1 means that runners haven't weaseled out of any of the game's intended requirements, while a 5 means they figured out how to bypass absolutely all of them. Pretty intuitive. The next one is the Normie Speedrunner Ratio, or NSR. Please, someone stop me from making more acronyms, there are already too many. Anyway, it is the result of dividing the playtime from howlongtobeat.com by the current world record, which gives an idea of how much faster speedrunners go than your average casual fan. In the Mario video though, including the raw NSR ended up producing some ridiculous disparities between games to the point where the SSC was mostly just NSR. So I came up with the adjusted NSR. A raw NSR of 1 to 10 turns into a 1, 10 to 20 into a 2, 20 to 100 into a 3, and 100 plus into a 4. I arrived at these particular boundaries by looking at the data and splitting them into 4 approximately equal groups. The SSC formula then is simply G times SB times NSR, which creates a clean scale from a minimum of 1 to a maximum of 100. I also removed the variable on whether or not any percent is the primary category, but I will try to bring that up whenever it's relevant for a particular game. And speaking of any percent, those are the runs we're discussing. Most games have plenty of categories that offer additional rules, but for today we're just looking at game plus GFP in its simplest form. Also, in the interest of time, since as you can tell this video is plenty long without them, I won't be covering any remakes. The increasingly common Zelda remake installments end up developing their own speedrunning worlds, often completely distinct from the game's original release. If you're curious, definitely check them out on your own, but for the purposes of this video, it's best to leave them out. There are also two games generally considered main series Zelda that I won't be covering: Four Swords and Triforce Heroes. Four Swords because its exclusively multiplayer nature, its initial packaging with a remake of A Link to the Past, and its extremely short playthrough compared to every other game makes me think of it more as a spin-off than a main game. Triforce Heroes because its speedrunning community seems to be focused primarily on individual levels, and only 3 people ever have submitted 80% runs, all in the last couple months, so I think it needs just a little more time to develop. If those are your favorite Zelda games, I'm sorry, the record holders' names are on the screen and links to the runs are in the description. Okay. No more setup, let's get to the runs. And we start at the beginning of it all. The original Legend of Zelda for the NES did things that no one at the time knew video games could do. Exploring the world of Hyrule with secrets cryptically hidden behind every bush was brand new. Perhaps the most memorable aspect of it was the amount of freedom allowed to the player. Once you collect your sword and go off alone, there is no specific order to what you're supposed to do. It's simply your job to explore every nook and cranny in whichever way you choose, and eventually you'll discover all 8 pieces of the Triforce and can go on to face down Ganon. This design allows speedrunners the opportunity to build their own custom path through the game. Of the basically infinite routes that are possible, runners have to figure out which single one is the fastest. Traditionally, Zelda 1 speedruns have done just that, hopping from dungeon to dungeon with the help of a little screen wrapping. And those runs are still the most popular, but the true 80% world record is something entirely different. The game has been beaten in only 2 minutes and 23 seconds by Unos. According to How Long to Beat, the average player takes 8.5 hours to finish, an incredible 214 times slower than the record, naturally giving us our first maximum NSR of 4. The key behind the short length of the run is an arbitrary code execution glitch, or ACE, which allows the runner to teleport directly to Zelda with some clever manipulation of the game's code. Every intended requirement is skipped, so this game clearly has an SB of 5. However, the entire run is basically just setting up the ACE, which for the most part doesn't even look that glitchy, so a glitch score of 2 is fitting here. Multiplying all this together gives an SSC of 40. We're off to a very strong start in the shocking speedrun department, and it's fitting that a game known for allowing the player a ton of freedom ultimately allows skipping almost directly to the credits. Just a year later, Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link took what the first game accomplished and, well, changed almost everything about it. Instead of a top-down perspective, it suddenly became a side-scrolling platformer with RPG elements. Instead of several different weapons to switch between, combat is just a sword and shield. Another change made was the linearity of the game, with all 7 dungeons intended to be completed in a specific order. However, luckily for speedrunners, the game isn't exactly the best at keeping track of where Link is. The record is 17 minutes and 54 seconds by light, a ratio of 38:1, giving us an NSR of 3. The run relies heavily on a glitch called Scroll Lock, which corrupts various tables in the game's code by entering and re-entering doors over and over again. The result is that the game loads rooms in side-scrolling sections incorrectly, allowing Link to enter and leave them in ways he was not intended to, and the effect on the game's visuals is pretty crazy. This also works on the overworld, allowing Link to warp past any barrier. The run ends up revolving around dipping into a few dungeons for necessary items, actually completing none of them, and then walking right up to the Great Palace and taking down Link's shadow. Since the final dungeon is played all the way through but none of the others are, I'll give an SB of 4, and thanks primarily to Scroll Lock, a glitch of 3. This produces an SSC of 36, slightly lower than but surprisingly similar to the first game in the series, given the drastic differences in gameplay between them. The Zelda series firmly established itself as a top-tier video game franchise with its SNES installment, A Link to the Past. It took everything the first game did well, refined it, and added a compelling narrative for the first time. With regard to linearity, it mixed the approaches of the first 2 games, requiring some of the 11 main dungeons to be completed in a certain order, but others, it's up to the player. So how many of them are speedrunners required to complete? Well honey, they don't even collect the sword. The record is 1 minute and 31 seconds by French runner Lomig. Another maxed out NSR and SB, clearly. Starting with a fairly simple trick to get out of bounds, runners activate Exploration Glitch, placing Link's sprite on the incorrect layer, which allows the bypassing of pretty much any obstacle you could think of. This allows Link to just walk under the map right to the end credits. A G of 4 seems fitting, as most of the short run is spent glitching out of bounds. While this is all technically impressive, you have to wonder how satisfying it could be to run the game in a way where you experience approximately 0% of it. As it turns out, these super short, game-breaking any percent runs are frequently not the most popular category for the community. They are simply too glitched. The crown in this case goes to any percent no major glitches, a much more fleshed out run which explores most of the game while maintaining the GFP, just with a few little rules. This really goes to show that speedrunners are not solely focused on destroying their game, but rather experiencing it from a fresh new angle. Zelda making its way onto handhelds for the first time brought us Link's Awakening, a strange game in many ways. Both Ganon and Zelda herself are nowhere to be found, and spoiler alert for a 27-year-old Game Boy game, it was all a dream, but not, like, Link's dream, the dream of a giant flying whale god that Link was able to physically interact with somehow. It's strange, and I love it. This final shot of the opening cutscene turns out to be foreshadowing for decades later when speedrunners would break this game open like a fucking egg. The record is 1 minute and 21 seconds by Global Trance, and it is a sight to see. Almost immediately, the runner glitches to some strange, out-of-bounds dimension that holds a treasure chest which contains the final cutscene of the game, and even that cutscene doesn't play exactly as intended. Due to the nature of the glitches used for this example of an arbitrary code execution, it quickly becomes completely incomprehensible to the uninitiated viewer, which was the standard I set when considering what a G of 5 would demand, and Link's Awakening absolutely accomplishes that. Add in an SB of 5 and an NSR of 4, and we have an SSC of 100, our first maximum with this formula. A humble Game Boy game manages to be near the pinnacle of brokenness in Zelda speedruns. As a side note, this is also an example of a game whose remake eclipsed the original in speedrunning prestige. A majority of the community is more interested in the Game Boy Color re-release, Link's Awakening DX, which is similarly broken as one might expect, and has lovely categories like any percent no squoob. If the previous games made the series well received, Ocarina of Time is what made it legendary. There's nothing I could say that hasn't already been said about the masterpiece of the Nintendo 64. Bringing Link into the third dimension unlocked a nearly infinite amount of new gameplay opportunities. Never before had freedom and exploration felt so real. Never before had Hyrule been so detailed and charming and cohesive. Players naturally felt compelled to stay in this world as long as they could, searching out everything the game had to offer. And speedrunners have proven that there is no limit. People will never exhaust the possibilities for entertainment that this beautiful game created, even if it means having to break it a little. Or a lot. It's been finished in 7 minutes and 32 seconds by save state with, you guessed it, an ACE credits warp. The depth of the movement provided by the 3D world is immediately apparent. All the new potential created by the game's design turns out to be exploitable in so many ways, something which I think is actually consistent with how Ocarina of Time encourages the player to explore and try new things all the time. After years and years of optimization and new discoveries, tens or maybe even hundreds of thousands of hours have been dedicated to whittling down this 26-hour journey into a 7.5-minute run. They've done the impossible and saved Hyrule without even leaving Kokiri Forest. All that's left is a couple cutscenes, a quick scramble to collect enough rupees to buy the shield, and then they finish. An SB of 5, of course, and a G of 3 are in order. OOT earns a high SSC of 60. As I've already mentioned, games like this don't have communities who care entirely about any percent. When I say that every single aspect of this game has been explored, I mean it, with every corner of the game having been fully destroyed and rebuilt into something new across all categories in which the game is speedrun. In creating a game which inspired in players the desire to learn as much as they could about it, Nintendo probably didn't anticipate this level of mastery, but I see it as a natural progression of their design philosophy. Now, Majora's Mask is about speedrunning. Well, not exactly, but it is one of the easiest games for someone to understand how a speedrunning community could develop. The game runs on a cycle of 3 in-game days, at the end of which the moon falls from the sky and straight up kills everybody. You can reset this cycle at any time, keeping key items you've collected but removing all other sorts of progress you may have made. This creates a sort of time pressure in the minds of everyone who ever played it, causing them to constantly think about how much time they have left and how to do things as quickly as they can so they don't risk running out of it. For people who felt a particularly strong connection with Majora's Mask's dark atmosphere and poignant storytelling, of course it's natural to consider how many cycles you would need if you played perfectly. 20 years later, and it turns out the answer is 2. The record is 2450 by Kai9698, and it plays the Song of Time exactly once. After working through the first cycle as quickly as possible, Kai heads to the Astral Observatory where he triggers yet another ACE credits warp. I promise there aren't nearly as many of these in the newer games. In fact, the specific method is actually very similar to Ocarina of Time's, but due to the differences in mechanics between the two games, the runs hardly resemble each other at all. In addition to the ACE, there are a few clips to get past guards and fences, earning a G of 3. MM's final SSC is 45, less shocking than OOT by a small margin due to a lower NSR. The time mechanic of this game creates challenge for the player by placing restrictions and pressure onto them, and that feeling is expanded and multiplied by the act of speedrunning it. Perhaps inspired by the absurd success of the first Pokemon games, Nintendo decided to round out the Game Boy by releasing 2 connected Zelda games at the same time, Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons. Each game had a distinctive gimmick. Ages had time travel and Seasons had season manipulation. The former is definitely cooler than the latter, so we'll talk about that one first. The record is 1 hour, 30 minutes, and 2 seconds by the Swedish runner Nitros, and this is our first game which is relatively glitch-free. A large majority of the run is spent playing the game as intended, just very quickly. A shocking amount of time is spent on these Goron minigames, which are necessary for certain items, for example. The most notable glitch in the run does let the runner warp directly to the final boss, but the catch is that it requires the Tune of Ages, one of the final upgrades unlocked by completing the third to last dungeon in the game. There are some other clever tricks to skip some dungeons, such as the extremely precise D2 skip, but the Tune of Ages presents a hard limit for how much of the game can be skipped at the moment. Ultimately, only 3 out of 8 intended dungeons are finished, giving us an SB of 3 and a G of 2. The SSC of 12 is our lowest yet, but this is still a fun run to watch, especially if you're familiar with the original game. Although I did compare the Oracle games to Pokemon earlier, the differences between them are far greater than what you would find between Pokemon games in the same generation. The mechanics, story, and dungeons are all changed to the point where both games have a distinct identity. The record in Oracle of Seasons is notably shorter than its counterpart, sitting at 54 minutes and 7 seconds, also by Nitros. Like Ages, this game doesn't seem particularly broken for the majority of the run, and coincidentally it also completes exactly 3 out of 8 dungeons. But that's where the similarities end. While the route through Ages revolved around collecting a late game upgrade as soon as possible, the Seasons route revolves around getting to a specific location where you can go on a rooster adventure. This little bird is just supposed to get Link across small gaps, but runners have figured out a way, through super complex game magic that goes way over my head, to duplicate them over and over again. The process is tedious and frustrating, like this goes on for several minutes, but it ultimately pays off when you take your avian army to the castle of the main villain, Onyx. Normally, a cutscene prevents you from making it too far until you've completed all the prerequisites, but now there are so many roosters on screen that the game simply fails to play it and Link can waltz right in. This qualifies for an SB of 3 and G of 2, which gives it an SSC of 12. That is exactly the same as Ages, but I still think this is an excellent example of how speedrunning can exacerbate differences between games that are otherwise pretty similar. While the Oracles did have their distinctions, they were both essentially about completing 8 dungeons so you could conquer the villain and save the girl. The speedruns, though, are about learning one particular song on the harp on one hand, and finding a rooster and making it multiply on the other. Their methods for achieving those goals diverge greatly, with plenty of tricks and techniques unique to each. Add in the applications of the differences which were built into the game, like the time travel and season manipulation, and you'll find that applying the GFP accentuates the disparity between the Oracles rather than homogenizing it. When The Wind Waker released in 2003, it shocked longtime players of the series, not only because of the jarring shift in art style which had mixed reception, but also due to the sheer size of the world it possessed. Sailing from island to island on the King of Red Lions across a seemingly endless ocean felt even more like a real adventure than anything that had come before. Although progression was locked to a fairly linear structure, the game still maintained a consistent feeling that the player could travel anywhere they wanted to at any time. In fact, the only thing stopping Link from just swimming to each island himself was running out of air. In his world record of 54 minutes and 31 seconds, Japanese runner Iwabi has Link swim to each island himself. Using a super swim glitch, he can break the normal progression and pacing of the game and get to wherever he wants in minimal time. Which is very cool, but the most important glitch and sequence break in the run comes from Barrier Skip. About halfway through the game, Link visits Hyrule Castle, frozen in time and deep below the sea. In the distance you can see Ganon's tower, but an invisible barrier prevents you from moving toward it until you've restored the power of the Master Sword. It's not unlike the feeling of seeing a boss door high up in a dungeon you just entered. What can I do to get there? What tools do I need to progress? Of course, the game wants you to go back up and collect a bunch more stuff first, but for years and years the closeness of a potential game-breaking skip taunted speedrunners. Getting past this barrier was such a big deal that when it was initially found in the HD remake of the game, that game became one of the most followed speedruns ever for a few months. And it wouldn't be too long before it was found in the GameCube version as well, requiring such extreme precision as manipulating Link's facing angle to be exactly 32,052 and rolling into the barrier until his X position is at least 24.599. Whew. Now, if you think carefully, you might assume that the final area of the game would require a lot of uncollected items, but don't worry, they have a way around that as well, thanks in large part to zombie hovers. It all comes together. The run is insane non-stop. It's hard to find a moment where the runner isn't performing a glitch of some kind, and every little thing is skipped aside from the bombs, Deku Leaf, and finishing the Forsaken Fortress. SSC of 54 for one of the craziest and most storied speedruns there is. Okay, so we've covered just over half of the games. 9 behind us, 8 to go. The wide range of experiences this series offers is readily apparent even in these earlier games. We've seen them make the jump from 2D to 3D, transition from dark and dramatic artwork to colorful and cartoonish, and experiment with both strict linearity and near total freedom. There is a through line though, that these games constantly foster a sense of agency in the player, the feeling that they are in control of exploring Hyrule however they want. And just wait till you see what's coming up next. All that said, Four Swords Adventures might be the game that inspires that feeling the least. Its average playtime is 14.5 hours, and the fastest completion is only about 7 times quicker. The world record is 2 hours, 2 minutes, and 26 seconds by ZMaster91. Its adjusted NSR is only 1, easily the lowest we've seen. The culprit is the world design, which departs massively from its predecessors, simply being 24 dungeon-like levels, one right after another like a Mario game. FSA was intended to be seen as a fun multiplayer experience rather than an epic adventure with a strong narrative, although unlike Four Swords for the Game Boy Advance, it did provide an option for those who wanted to take it on alone. While this game might be the one with the least amount of freedom yet, when speedrunners find an inch, they take a mile. The core mechanic involves the player controlling 4 different links at the same time, having the ability to switch to each individually or arrange them into one of a few formations. This allows for some complex and creative puzzle solving, but it can be exploited creatively as well. While all 24 levels are played, within the levels, glitches and skips are sprinkled around to get past a fair few obstacles, earning FSA speedruns an SB of 1.5 and a G of 2. The SSC is only 3, the lowest yet by a good margin because specific features of the game design hinder speedrunning unlike most games in the series. However, the gameplay opportunities that are new are enough to give Four Swords Adventures a special flair. Zelda's Game Boy Advance entry used the art style established by Wind Waker and the new antagonist Vaati introduced in Four Swords Adventures. Compared to other games in the series, it may not have brought a whole lot new to the table, but it was still a neat little adventure nonetheless. Emphasis on the little, as the main gimmick of the game revolves around shrinking to a tiny size with the help of the sardonic hat bird thing Eslo. For speedrunning though, this mechanic is rather too straightforward and simple to be all that exploitable. Pair that with the facts that the 6 dungeons need to be completed in a specific order, and that progression to the next one depends very strictly on completion of the previous, and Minish Cap isn't all that broken at first glance. It's been beaten in 1 hour, 37 minutes, and 38 seconds by Vlak SR, a speedrunner hailing from Honduras. Despite not being able to skip dungeons or abuse the new shrinking mechanic, this game's passionate community has still clipped an impressive amount of time off the run. Out-of-bounds glitches are very common within dungeons, which happen to be very cool to look at, almost like an Easter egg, and skip plenty of intra-dungeon checkpoints, earning an SB of 1.5. Add in another frequently used glitch involving combining staircases and playing the Ocarina, which somehow gives the player the ability to freeze and unfreeze time, and they've managed to achieve a G of 3 despite their roadblocks. SSC of 4.5, a smaller coefficient for the smallest link, but the run does still pack a fair few big shocks in. Released at both the end of the GameCube's lifespan and the beginning of the Wii's, Twilight Princess once again completely reimagined the aesthetic of the Zelda universe. This Hyrule is dark and moody and mysterious. It's also the longest adventure yet, taking an average of 37.5 hours to finish the main story. The German runner give me a sec. The German runner Case holds the record with a time of 2 hours, 54 minutes, and 9 seconds, which despite being the longest run so far, still gets an NSR of 2. Twilight Princess actually has a bit of a reputation among Zelda speedruns as a very unbroken game because, as you have seen and will see, the other 3D Zeldas may be comparatively more thoroughly broken with more skips and glitches, especially in the last couple years. If you watch it without that preconception though, you would never guess that it's the case. Twilight Princess speedrunners have accomplished so much already. Literally, the first part of the run involves clipping out of bounds to skip huge portions of the early game. Soon after that, the runner accesses the Master Sword much earlier than intended, which allows Link to put on his first suit and turn into a wolf at will. This trick allows runners to explore the wolf mechanic on an even deeper level than your average player. Each area has different opportunities depending on whether Link is wolf or dude, and along with the new technical skills one can master, these early transformations unlock a new level of exploration and puzzle solving. A handful of the game's many other checkpoints are skipped as well, with the help of enough glitches for a G of 2. However, the run's length is a bit frustrating due to the other handful of checkpoints that can't be worked around. For example, the only reason the runner goes to Snow Peak Mansion at all is to obtain the ball and chain, which is only necessary because it's the only item capable of stunning Zant, an endgame boss, in just one phase of a long fight. Ultimately, only 5 of the 9 dungeons are completed, SB of 3, using a route that's become pretty inscrutable to an outside observer. Twilight Princess's SSC is 12, which is lower than the other 3D Zeldas, sure, but pretty high for its perception of being a less broken speedrun, especially considering the next 2 games we're going to talk about. Link returned to the seas in Phantom Hourglass, a direct sequel to the Wind Waker for the DS. As is standard for handheld entries, its story is relatively simple, and its playthrough is on the shorter side at 16.5 hours. Despite that, its record is still over 3 hours long, 3 hours, 10 minutes, and 56 seconds to be exact, performed by Mr. Shasta. The game was very dedicated to showing off the unique features of the DS. It utilized both screens effectively, required blowing on the mic to solve puzzles, and most importantly, used the stylus and touchscreen as the exclusive method of controlling Link. As a result, many players found the game rigid and felt that their control over their character was limited when compared to other Zeldas. In general, the fewer abilities a player has, the fewer opportunities there are for speedrunners to discover exploits, and that holds true here. Add in the highly linear nature of the game, the long travel times between islands, the need to return to the central Temple of the Ocean King several times, and it's easy to see why this run is so long. It really gives the runners time to ponder important questions.
Do you think you could suck on a piranha plant's toes?
Now there is a newer sequence break, skipping the Regal Necklace and therefore an entire island, but it only saves 4 minutes. And there are some cool glitches involving the hammer and the arrows which save chunks of time within dungeons, but most of the run is glitch free. It comes out to a tiny SSC of 2.25. However, I do feel the need to point out that Phantom Hourglass is not by any means a bad speedrun, just one of the less shocking ones. The skill, memorization, and endurance needed to pull off a full run of this game is insane, and it's unfair for all the attention to always go to the more broken side of things. Now, if you thought Phantom Hourglass was on the slow side, then let's take a look at the second DS installment, Spirit Tracks. The fastest it's ever been done is a whopping 4 hours, 14 minutes, and 17 seconds by the Japanese runner ASAS. Another NSR of 1, and the lowest raw NSR in the series as well. Now, the concept for Spirit Tracks is a bit out there. It maintains a lot of the features of its predecessor, but takes place 100 years later when Link is training to be an engineer, like for trains. Oh, and Zelda's dead. Seriously, a big part of the gameplay is using her ghost to possess massive suits of armor, the inspiration for my least favorite move in Smash Ultimate. ST also dials up the linearity to the point where the game is entirely on rails, both literally and figuratively. The dungeons must be completed in a specific order, and you have to return to the Tower of Spirits in between every one. Every travel section is long and tedious, at least when thinking about the GFP, and there are no ways to skip them or speed them up to any significant degree. Despite a huge overworld, there's hardly any exploration of it, and the only gameplay when driving is honking at pigs and avoiding these terrible Thomas the Tank Engine demons. However, this song does slap so hard it's the second time it's played in this video, and there are some visually impressive moments along the way. In the end though, there aren't any skips or glitches to speak of. It's ones all the way down. Spirit Tracks in 2020 still has the lowest possible SSC. It also has the lowest number of total runners of any game that I'm covering, which introduces a sort of chicken-egg scenario. Ultimately, it's logical that the Zelda game which restricts the player's ability to make choices and freely explore the world the most has the longest and least shocking speedrun out of all of them. But just because it's like this now doesn't mean it always will be. In fact, Mr. Shasta has set up a bounty of $370 for any breakthroughs in either of the DS games. So if you want to be the one to rescue Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks from the ignominy of being the least shocking Zelda speedruns, there's real money in it for you at the end. So when I first came up with the idea for this video over a year ago, Skyward Sword was nearly 5 hours long. Since then, it has only gone through breakthrough after breakthrough. Just this summer, a new era of SS speedruns began, with the record being broken over a dozen times since June 15th. The current record, at time of editing, is 1 hour, 23 minutes, and 32 seconds by SVA. A unique aspect to this speedrun is that while you only complete the game once, you essentially do it over multiple files. The key element to breaking this game was reverse back-in-time magic, a glitch which allows other files to apply scene flags that haven't actually been fulfilled in the main file. The details are quite technical, but explained very well in this video by Gymnast86. The most recent development was the early boss rush, which I'll explain in a bit of detail to give an example of the kind of puzzle solving that goes into designing the routes for these more complex games. First, the runner uses reverse bit magic to complete the minecart quest in Lanayru Desert much earlier than intended. Then they do a second reverse bit magic to trigger a text box which marks the Thunder Dragon as being healed. Normally, this is not something that runners would go out of their way to do, but it's important because it unlocks the boss rush. Now, the game has a list of bosses that it expects the player to already have completed by the time they access the rush. In order to accurately load an early game boss then, it has to unset certain flags, and then, and this is the key, set them as complete after the fight is over. So by challenging the imprisoned's first fight, the runner tricks the game into believing that they have finished both the Ancient Cistern and the Fire Sanctuary, even though they have done neither. Further manipulation of the boss rush allows the runner to check all the boxes normally needed to access the Gate of Time and move on to the final section of the game. It blows my mind to think of the process it must have taken to develop this technique. And all of this is only possible because of the simple decision to let the player move around on Skyloft while still on the file select screen. The end result is a pretty glitchy run, and one which skips all but 2 dungeons in the game. Its SSC is 36, pretty high considering the primary criticism of Skyward Sword was its linearity. Despite the illusion of freedom with riding the loft wings, the game is actually one of the Zeldas with the least amount of player agency, something which rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. In a sense, the speedrun fulfills what the game promised, a more freeform, creative game experience. But, to Nintendo's credit, they did listen to the critics, as evidenced by the design of the 3DS entry A Link Between Worlds. It was in many ways a love letter to the older Zelda games, bringing back the top-down perspective and a lot of characters and world elements from A Link to the Past. Importantly, it also brought back freedom of choice. After collecting 3 pendants and accessing the alternate dimension of Lorule, the player can save the 7 sages in whichever order they want. This gives speedrunners essentially endless possibilities for new routes and strategies. The record is 1 hour, 21 minutes, and 1 second by Legend of Zahir, and it's a wild ride that strikes a satisfying balance between big skips and mastery of the game's intended mechanics. The new gimmick introduced was the ability for Link to merge with walls and walk along them, or if you're a speedrunner, go right through them. In the end, all 7 sages are collected, but the skips used to get to them are pretty incredible. The entirety of the Desert Palace dungeon is passed over, for example. A Link Between Worlds earns an SB of 2 and a G of 3. SSC of 12, a number which I suspect would be a good deal lower had the developers not let the player have so much freedom. Alright, 1 game left. Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild was an entirely new experience. If previous games believed in creating a sense of exploration, this one took it to the absolute extreme, delivering a Hyrule that can legitimately be explored for hundreds of hours and still have secrets waiting to be uncovered. Once again, the Zelda series chooses to experiment, this time by taking its familiar features and placing them in a new open-world setting. It even introduced voice acting for the first time after years of requests, which, mixed feelings personally.
It seems I'm the only one with a mind of my own.
But most relevant to the speedrunning conversation is the decision to require basically nothing in order to finish it. Everything is optional, even clothes. There are 4 dungeons in different corners of the map, but should the player like, they can just fly directly into the castle to face Calamity Ganon as soon as they get the paraglider. It should come as no shock then that despite a 50-hour average playthrough, the world record is only 26 minutes and 54 seconds, a max NSR. Performed earlier this year by Skateodara, the speedrun experiences practically nothing of the treasure trove of content in Breath of the Wild. And yet I can only give it a 1.5 in SB because aside from a few clips, this route was fully intended. It is entirely in line with the spirit of the game to do whatever we want with the canvas Nintendo has given us. And when developers give players this many tools and this much freedom, they tend to come up with something extraordinary, and oh have they ever with this run. By exploiting the stasis and bomb abilities, Link can rocket toward the castle so fast the game can't even load it right. Then all that's left is to collect some weapons, wail on Ganon without even putting on pants, and the game is done. Our final shocking speedrun coefficient is 18, a number that seems low until you realize that this is exactly the kind of thing the game wants us to do. Breath of the Wild is the peak of the Zelda trend of encouraging varying playstyles and constructing a deep feeling of exploration and intrigue. But I still can't wait to see where they go from here. Okay, we just talked about a whole lot of games. Let's do a quick rundown and figure out the least and most shocking Zelda speedruns. If 2 SSCs were the same, I broke the tie with the raw NSR, using the same formula as the Mario video. From low to high, here's the ranking. Spirit Tracks, Phantom Hourglass, Four Swords Adventures, Minish Cap, Oracle of Ages, A Link Between Worlds, Twilight Princess, Oracle of Seasons, Breath of the Wild, Skyward Sword, Zelda 2, The Legend of Zelda, Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, Ocarina of Time, A Link to the Past, and finally, Link's Awakening. These runs represent the full possible range of SSCs, from 1 to 100. Their raw SSCs range from 4 to 16,667. Even if you would never speedrun a game yourself, I hope you can appreciate how much depth there is to this weird niche gaming hobby. Endless effort has been poured in by so many people. The Legend of Zelda is about being a small person in a huge world, but with plenty of courage to make that world yours. Though it may have strayed from the idea of player freedom at times, it always returns to that pillar, letting players off the leash and saying do what you want to do and be who you want to be. While everything else about the series may change, that through line remains. So it's not at all surprising when tons of people look at these games and say, hey, I think I just want to do it really fast. It fits perfectly with the philosophy of the design. The puzzle aspect is still present with the complexities of figuring out techniques and routes and strategies. The tight and challenging combat is still there, now requiring even more precision and skill than a first playthrough ever would. And of course, Link and Hyrule are still there. What could be more fulfilling in a Zelda game than mastering all the abilities our hero has and using them to conquer every inch of his world in ways no one could have thought possible? Hey, thanks so much for watching until the end. I put so much effort into my videos and I appreciate every single view and comment that I get. Please like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you're interested in seeing more of what I do, and share it on Reddit and Twitter and the like. That last one really helps me out a ton. Also, I covered a lot of different games in this video, so let me know if I made any mistakes that need correcting. Links to all the runs are in the description. Finally, let me know in the comments what kind of videos you'd like to see in the future. The next one won't be about speedrunning actually, but it will still be gaming related, so I hope you'll stick with me as I try something pretty different. Follow me on Twitter and Twitch if you like, and join my Discord channel if you want to discuss anything in this video or previous ones, as that's the best place to talk to me directly. I've been Skyhoppers, see you next time.